Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Caval, its Professional Development Interest Group, PDIG, and the Caval Research and Information Group, which is CRIG. My name is Lisa Gribben, and I am an Open Education Librarian at Deakin University and the Chair of CRIG. I am joined here to look after you all today by two of my colleagues, Fiona Russell, PDIG Chair and Expert Searching and Consultant Services Lead at Deakin University, and Beth Deans, CRIG's Deputy Chair and the Team Leader, Library Learning Services at Federation University. Fiona will facilitate the Q&A with the speakers later, while Beth will wrap up the session. So as we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia where we live, learn and work. We acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other First Nations peoples and communities and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, sky and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. I would also like to extend my respects to any First Nations peoples attending today. I am joining you from the lovely lands of the Wathaurong country today, and I encourage you to please share which country you are attending from in the chat. So in a time where mis and disinformation is rampant, where the geopolitical landscape is uncertain and sometimes astounding, we all know that libraries are crucial in providing reliable information. But do our users know this and trust us? And what role do libraries play in times of crisis when trust in information is eroded? We hope that today's three speakers will be able to shed some light on this as they share their thoughts with us. If you have any technical questions during the session, please type them into the chat and the Caval team will assist you. The chat is also the space to connect with others today, and you can share your reflections and thoughts on anything raised in the presentations. Today's webinar is made up of 3 presentations followed by a Q&A with all the speakers afterwards, which Fiona will facilitate. If you have questions for the speakers throughout the webinar, please submit them through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your window, and we'll get to as many as possible. Through the Q&A function, you can also see the questions of others, upvote questions or add comments to existing questions as appropriate. I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Clare Thorpe, who is an award-winning library leader, research practitioner, and non-executive board director. While she has worked in academic and state libraries since 2001, she is currently the Director, Library Services at Southern Cross University. On behalf of everyone here today, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Clare and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Yugambeh people at the southern end of the Gold Coast. I'd like to start today with a story. In mid-2023, I had a coffee networking date with someone who I hadn't met before, someone I respected and thought were incredibly intelligent, and we had a great conversation, and we talked about some writing that they were doing, and they were using ChatGPT. After the meeting, they emailed me and asked if I could help them find some references that ChatGPT had cited in the summary that they provided to them as part of the response of the prompts. Being a good information professional, I did some digging and had to advise them that 4 of the 5 references were probably hallucinations, as there was no evidence of them ever existing or even the authors being real people. While this is probably not a surprise to this audience, what surprised me about this particular interaction was that this was someone who was well educated, very intelligent in my opinion, had been the CEO of a major not-for-profit national charity, and yet they were blindly trusting a large language model tool. So it really made me stop and think about why were they doing that? And it was a great reminder for me that the information skills that I have as a librarian and information professional, and the way that I understand information sources and technologies is quite different to the way that other people understand them. And these skills and my expertise are things that perhaps I shouldn't take for granted. So when I spoke to Fiona and Sarah about their requirements for today's presentation, the brief they gave me was be provocative, but don't be scary. And I'll be honest, that's actually really difficult to do some days. I can open my email inbox and receive an ad for a webinar advertising, "Will AI replace librarians?" Even just before this session, I was looking on LinkedIn and seeing posts from colleagues in the US about all sorts of things that are quite scary. The digital disappearance of publicly funded research and the defunding of repositories like the Clearinghouse ERIC. However, I've been working in libraries since 2001, as noted in Lisa's introduction. And my experience tells me that the challenges we're facing in our profession now are actually not necessarily new. Information has never been immutable and consistently reliable. Misinformation and disinformation have always been with us right back to the ancient times. Information has always been contested, confusing, conflicting, and yes, it disappears. While the defunding and vanishing of data and research publications is currently a very active, noisy, and targeted activity in the US, it's not new. It's certainly commonplace in war zones such as the Ukraine, where volunteers have been actively collaborating to digitise and preserve Ukrainian cultural heritage since the Russian invasion began. And it happens here in Australia as well, sometimes actively, but often quietly, passively, through neglect, apathy, and disinterest. So, for example, in late 2023, the Analysis and Policy Observatory, a really valuable repository of public policy, research reports, and grey literature, almost stopped functioning because the university that had hosted it for more than 20 years was no longer able to support it. APO was saved very much at the last minute by a not-for-profit foundation and continues to be a great source of research that is not available in other places. So let me tell you another story, this time about disappearing information about the Australian library industry. Last year, I took on a little bit of a passion project to write an overview of information literacy practice and research in Australia to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the term information literacy being coined. Now, this was of personal interest to me because earlier in my career, in the first decade of the 21st century, I worked in the information literacy space. It was very much a hot topic. And I was involved in a number of grassroots organisations, including the Australian and New Zealand Institute of Information Literacy, which published some of the standards that you might be aware of if you've been around as long as I have. That particular agency disappeared, again, because the parent organisation that hosted it no longer was able to, and it sort of faded away. And to be honest, I don't actually know 100% what the story is there because I wasn't working in the space when that happened. I was aware that the digital record of ANZL had pretty much completely disappeared, that there were only glimpses and glimmers available of it in web archives such as Trove and the Wayback Machine. But what I hadn't expected when I started doing my research was the scale of the digital black hole that reflected not only ANZL, but a whole range of information literacy activities, events, and groups in Australia, particularly from those in the first decade of the 21st century. So the 7 conferences that ANZL hosted, none of those papers could be found anywhere. Now, this is annoying for me as a pseudo-historian, but it also made me think about the fact that if we as library workers aren't preserving our own history, what else aren't we saving? And does that mean we can't be trusted? And then there's the case of disappearing data repositories. So Strecker et al. In 2023 analysed the research data repository R3 data, finding that more than 6% of the indexed repositories had been shut down. And the median age of a repository at the time of shutdown was a very young 12 years. Less than half of those repositories that shut down did not migrate their data anywhere else. It just vanished. So if these challenges are not necessarily new, as the great Dame Shirley Bassey sang, it's all just a little bit of history repeating. What lessons can we learn from the past about how to respond to and endure our present uncertainty? So I thought we'd step back in time and go right back to the middle of the 20th century, when library automation was being introduced for the first time. And I'm very much indebted to Cosroe and Hinchcliffe's conference paper from 2014, which is a cracker of a read and has lots of fantastic quotes, some of which I'm going to show you today. These quotes, I think, are both timeless and timely, and perhaps they could even have been written now. So, for example, in 1963, J.R. Pearce argued that library users would smother under the flood of information and misinformation that library automation would produce. Writing in Library Journal in 1961, Jesse Shearer argued that the overselling of an idea at its experimental stage will lead to ill-defined library programs and a sacrifice of quality. And in 1973, at the very exciting Pre-Conference Institute in Library Automation, Alan Wiener argued that people want information now, and they will go where they can get it, which may not be the library. We skip ahead to 2007 and have a look at the findings of literature review about librarians' attitudes and roles in the age of the internet. So what I've put on screen here, I know this is a lot of text, but what I've done is just essentially transcribe the headings that the author used in this literature review and their results. And I think if I replace the words the internet with generative artificial intelligence, most of these headings would remain current, and this article could have perhaps been published in the past couple of years. Certainly, the lack of standardisation reminded me of hearing a colleague around 2008 trying to get their head around the idea of hashtags on social media and actually asking the question, who was in charge of the controlled vocabulary of hashtags? If we skip ahead another 10 years to 2017, and this article that looks at why librarians don't like discovery layers, again, I think some of these statements are very timely and are certainly things that I've heard in the last couple of months with the appearance of AI enhancements within database and discovery layers and things like Scopus AI and Primo AI. So what have we learned from this history? Well, in 1967, L. Quincy Mumford, the Librarian of Congress at that time, pondered the cyclical nature of the issues that plague libraries, writing, "Our problems repeat themselves over and over in every age." And I think that's as true in 1967 as it is in 2005. Cosroe and Hinchcliffe concluded their 2014 survey of the past by suggesting that library workers need to continuously reinvent themselves, the profession and the role of libraries to remain competitive, relevant and trusted. So what's the too long didn't read summary of all of this history? Well, I think it's best captured by Shea's first rule of netiquette, which was published in the 1994 book titled Netiquette. And yes, the word netiquette made me giggle so much last week that I had to include it and say it several times in this presentation. So Shea's first rule of netiquette is remember the human. And actually, if you have a look at this book, Shea's laws of netiquette translate very well to contemporary social media behaviour, and Shea was perhaps a prophet well before their time. Remember the human is a good reminder that the technology, the tool or the container of the information matters less than the way we connect with people and we earn their trust. So the quote on screen there that I've tried to make pretty is from Sturgis's article. And as Sturgis wrote in 2002, what we do is more about people than systems. So our job is not necessarily to panic or to be scared about new ways of engaging with information, but to learn, to understand, to critique the benefits and risks, to share our expertise in thinking critically and reflectively, and to guide people to make information choices that benefit themselves, their community, and the planet, to share our different view of the world as information professionals with others. So today's theme raises issues about integrity and trust. Library workers pride themselves on being among the top trusted occupations and professions. And a UK survey from 2018 that is often cited by CILIP puts libraries in the top 5 trusted professions in the UK after medical professionals, teachers, and the police. Cavall even has the phrase trusted partner in their vision statement. But does trust matter? And who does it matter to? So this vendor report caught my eye when I was researching this presentation. Yes, it's good to be trusted. The 141 academics and students and staff in this study trust their library, but they don't think it's easy to use. So let's think about that for a minute. If convenience is valued more than trust, then people may trust us, but they won't use us first, and they might not use us at all. As predicted in 1973 by Alan Wiener, they will go elsewhere. Like my colleague in 2023, using ChatGPT for convenience and ease, even though it generated misinformation and hallucinations. So is it even worth worrying about trust if convenience is prioritised by our users? Well, if we ascribe to the remember the human mantra, then trust remains important. Trust is earned through human connection, regardless of the systems, the technology, the containers. And I haven't put on screen here, but hat tip here to Helen Rimmer's book, The Kind Librarian, that was published last year, which introduced me to the trust triangle. And if you're interested in kindness in libraries and the workplace, I recommend Helen's book to you. So Frey and Morris visualised trust as a triangle with three core drivers: authenticity, logic, and empathy. So people trust when they believe they're interacting with the real you, the authentic you, and not a chatbot. When they have faith in your judgment and competence, so your logic, and when they feel that you care about them, so that's the empathy piece. So perhaps we could argue that tools like generative AI at the moment only meet one of those requirements, the logic, although perhaps even that is not necessarily trustworthy. However, if convenience is valued more than trust, then the challenge for us is to create experiences that re-engage our staff, our students, our researchers, and the community, to earn their trust and to make it as easy as possible for them to access trusted and reliable information. So from my short review of library history and my personal experience, I think our role is the same as it ever was. Misinformation and disinformation has always been with us, and it always will be with us. Our role is to know and to live out our values, and live out the values that underpin our work as information professionals. So that means practicing critical librarianship and evidence-based practice, examining our own motivations and decision-making processes, doing better, making our systems, our collections more convenient, more easy to use, and easier to assess whether they are trustworthy or not. To be information literate and to be lifelong learners ourselves, to implement transparency, to demystify our work and showcase our expertise, to reflect and admit when we do get it wrong, because we do, and to work collectively together in this endeavour, and to remember the human with empathy. Remember that we see the world differently to others as an information professional, at least I know I do. So in the present cycle of change, I go back to my why and my how. This is my touchstone when faced with new challenges, new threats, new ways of working. And I guess this is why I'm still working in libraries after 24 years. Libraries and library workers have evolved and endured through the various plagues of technological innovation. And dare I say it, each time our services and experiences have improved for the better. So when the tools and the technology change, and the way we find and evaluate and use and create information continues to evolve, and the powers that be try to silence and control, don't be scared, and don't be scary, be empowering.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your absolutely wonderful and reassuring presentation and the journey to our past to better understand our present and future, including the pearl that was netiquette, which has generated a few offshoots from the chat. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Suzana Sukovic, who is our second speaker. Suzana is the Director of College Research at the Presbyterian Ladies College in Sydney and an industry fellow at the University of Technology Sydney's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Among other things, she is the founder and leader of Alia Lark, the Library Applied Research Collective, and she joins us today to explore and reflect on what being a wave rider is like today. Welcome, Suzana.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I see that Claire and I are very much on the same page. So I'm starting with a little bit of history too, and I'm starting way away with the first written complaint. And it is a complaint that copper delivered was not what was described. And after that, we had centuries and centuries of information presented in a way that was perceived as not correct or really blatantly misinformation. But skipping all these centuries, what had happened at the turn of this century was internet that became publicly available. And with internet, we had democratization of information, we had empowerment, but we also had a flood of information. And that flood is something that has changed the nature of information and how it's perceived. So around that time, a little bit later, I did my PhD study, which was a research into how academics interact with electronic texts, primary documents in electronic form. And back then they talked about electronic information as air, vast ocean of information, going in fishing, potluck. And that idea that information is difficult to pinpoint is part of our public imagination. Matrix, Blade Runner. And nowadays with AI, when source of information is even more difficult to understand, we are probably coming even closer to this campusing water we imagined in the films. So my wave rider metaphor, I'm using 4 meanings, and they're actually main meanings anyway. Starting from aircraft, any vehicle that uses own shockwave to improve its overall performance. Now, it is not the first shockwave that the libraries are experiencing, and as politicians say, never waste a good crisis. This is an opportunity to reconsider what we are doing and to propel ourselves into something new. Going clockwise, we have Wave Boy, and anyone who knows me would know that that would be probably my favorite one. And it is about being very conscious of what's going around us, and that is collecting data and informing how we are dealing with our environment. And I think nowadays it is more important than ever. Then the wave rider in a sense of management and leadership, admittedly, I haven't read this book, but it is about management that's constantly seizing upon opportunity when others see no possibility. This is the description of this book. And one opportunity there is that leadership doesn't have to come from the top. In a study of how data is used in non-clinical health practice, I found a really important, and my co-authors who wrote the article with me, the important role of people who are shifting boundaries. And these people are not necessarily on the top. They're usually curious people who have a background in different disciplines, people who want to experiment. And smart leaders who are leading the company or the team recognize who these people are to use their skills. And then in the end, and this is the most important one, is the person, and the person who rides the waves. And the person who rides the waves is actually informed by everything that was before, the institution, the data gathering, and the leadership. Now, looking back at the time when internet became a big thing, here's one quote saying that the flood of information is going to be so difficult to manage, and that was partially a joke, partially serious, that librarians are going to be the only profession able to bring order to the chaos. And then the title of this article, The Midas Crisis, refers to a paradoxical situation in which users starve for information even while surrounded by it. And while filters and search engines and so on are doing a much better job now, if we insert mis and disinformation before the word information, I think we are dealing with a similar problem. Now, how does it look like when we look at our traditional collections, our traditional services, and our current issues? Currently, we have mis and disinformation, we have censorship and book banning, we have rise of pseudoscience, and actually from recently pseudo-history. We have closure of digital collections in countries where we didn't expect that, and rising costs coupled with funding cuts across the globe that are affecting universities and their libraries. On the other side, we have library collections that are purposefully developed. There is a quality control. There is attempted objectivity. It was never perfect, but that attempt that we preserve access to information from different perspectives with different worldviews has become more important. We have preservation of original records. We are trying to be very democratic in the way we provide physical access. And also traditionally, we have government support, at least in democracies. And this is something that's been shifting. So the question is, how can we address some of the current issues with our good, reliable traditions? And also, in parallel with library collections, we have a shift in information behaviors, intellectual access, and how it reflects on education. Just recently, I've done some focus groups and interviews about generative AI in education. And one teacher was talking about how students are becoming removed from their source. That the idea of primary, secondary, tertiary source is becoming further and further away from what students understand and use. And this is absolutely crucial in understanding that educators at any level, secondary, tertiary, are concerned how this use of information is going to affect critical thinking. This is a screenshot from a website on which University of Melbourne presents their recent study, where they looked at what it actually means to think critically. An area where they find that students are struggling is to do with judging the credibility of their online sources, lack of the ability to analyze evidence. And if we can find our place in all of these three major points, our bread and butter is the first area, judging the credibility of their sources. Then again, looking at what AI means in education, and we are all here to support education and research. Educators are looking more at how they are going to capture evidence of learning as a process rather than a product. And this is a fantastic opportunity for us because they need help. And we can help with looking at the research process and helping students develop understanding of the research process. In my study of AI in education, everyone is talking about something we would call digital and AI capabilities or information capabilities. They don't call it that. I was deeply concerned that education experts, IT experts are talking about these things and no one is mentioning librarians. And then I looked for librarians who can tell me more about AI integration from their perspective. I found some. And what I'm thinking now is that this is another moment where we need to articulate quickly and very clearly how we can help, how we are coming on board. Leaving it to others to articulate it for us is just not going to happen because they have their own worries and they need help. Another area where we are going back to some of our traditional services is reading. And I'm seeing from primary school to workplace education how reading has impact, how the ability to read complex texts and understand complex texts is critical. It helps critical thinking, it helps creativity, all these things. And in my workplace study, I've talked with data analysts who are saying, I can't progress in my career properly because I actually skipped some of the reading skills. So my question here is, can we look back at some of our traditional services? We do that at schools, but in university environment, reading advisory, book clubs. How can we help academics by developing students' reading skills? And then that connection across lifespan. We are talking about the time when we are talking about AI assistants that may be with a person from very early on, definitely from kindergarten, throughout their lives, helping them learn. Now, in that environment, we talk about reading from primary school to workplace, where we can all help, but we are in silos. And the idea of silos was very popular back 20, 30 years ago. And we certainly have improved in the meantime, and our silos are way more palatable, way prettier, but they're still silos. And we're dealing with water and we are having silos. And we have to think as organizations, and especially with cutting funds, how we can connect more. And then at the time when we are considering what it means to be a human, what human knowledge means, human touch is more important again than ever, not because it is more important than ever, but because there is that sense that humans are replaceable. So we know that space and engagement with community is important, and it needs to stay important. We are starting to work more in the area of well-being and supporting well-being of our communities. That's important. But embedding our presence is going to be a big challenge. On the right-hand side of the screen are the models that girls in my school developed, answering the question how they imagine the classroom of the future. And they all imagine some hologram or a thinking orb, but they all also see nice, comfortable furniture. They also want to come to the classroom at least occasionally. Most of them want to have a teacher in that space. My question for us is, how can we be part of the orb, part of the hologram, and also at least occasionally physical presence in that space? Just this Saturday, I met two former students, both first-year university students, both at the same university, and they were telling me about the university library. It's big, first thing. The second thing they mentioned were people. One of them said, oh, it's so easy to find people. I feel I'm supported. Another one said, they're from different disciplines, I miss school libraries so much. I miss people because I don't know where to find people, and I'm counting on my friends or more experienced peers. This is the youngest generation coming to universities. People do matter. So why trust the library? What libraries do is based on purpose to serve. If history in the last 20, 30 years has done well for us is making it clearly, abundantly clear that companies are not looking after people in general. They're looking after their profit. We are there to serve. We also have high ethical and professional standards, and we need to keep them. I sometimes worry what it means to be a library professional, considering constantly moving boundaries. We know how to make a really good combination of the best that human and a machine can offer. We need to be, we already are, but need to be even more basing our services on the best available evidence. Then we need to evolve and stay relevant, and again, strongly pointing out being embodied and embedded. I think with AI, this is going to be absolutely crucial. That is going to make us real, and being real in this information environment is incredibly important. And one question I think we need to keep asking everyone in the society, if libraries don't, who will? Companies certainly won't. So I'm going to end this talk with this example, which is actually bringing me back to the present and the past. On the left-hand side of the screen is something I did years ago at the time when digitization was the most important thing in the libraries, or one of the most important things. I worked in a rare book library, and that was at the University of Sydney. And I digitized a diary accompanied by some beautiful watercolors written by Evelyn Nicholson in 19th century. Evelyn Nicholson was daughter-in-law of Sir Charles Nicholson. So I recently went back to this digitized project because I'm doing another journaling project at school, and found these beautiful pictures of water. So we have this record telling us exactly what this digitization is about. And then I asked ChatGPT a few questions, and I got some interesting and good answers about other similar diaries in the 19th century written by women about Australia. I then asked it for some excerpts, and the first one is certainly correct, but then the source is not. When I clicked on the link, it was a wrong link. And also a reference to Public Library UK is certainly not where this resource is coming from. Then there was that second excerpt about Evelyn supposedly looking at the sea. And I couldn't find any evidence that that was in the diary when I searched the library website. And then I asked ChatGPT, where is this coming from? And it apologized. Oh, sorry, it's not there. I made it up. And I think it really does point out how important it is to have the source, even if people are going down the wrong track, that the actual source exists. And I would like to go back to this made-up quote, supposedly written by Evelyn Nicholson, about gazing upon vast expanse of water, that huge, awe-inspiring blue. If that were information, I want myself, I want everyone to be able to look upon that water. But I want us all to be on a good ship, guided by a person equipped with good technology, with the maps, but also with the boats, because we never know when it's going to crash. And I want us all to be able to swim and to be able to navigate. And I think the library can do a lot to support all of these things, which mean that we will be able to grow and not only survive, but really thrive in this new environment.
Thank you so much, Suzana, and for your thought-provoking presentation. I think connection fostering learning and capabilities, and bringing some of the order to the chaos is something we all resonate very strongly with. It'll certainly be exciting to see how we all evolve and navigate these seas going into the future. So our final presentation comes from Deakin University, where Dr. Danny Kingsley is Director of Library Services Information. Danny is also Ambassador for the OAPEN Library of Open Access Books and has extensive experience working at universities in Australia and internationally. She joins us today to highlight how the current geopolitical landscape, combined with the rollout of AI tools across many discovery channels, offer an unprecedented space for information providers. She isn't promising all the solutions, but will offer a ray of hope for us all. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you. I hope it's hopeful. So I've just put in the abstract because it's helpful for people who are looking at the slides and not actually listening to the presentation. But I'm talking today about shifting sands. This photograph is from where I am at Wurundjeri land near Geelong, about the path narrowing. And I think that's a good analogy for what's happening for us at the moment. So I'll be covering a few things, the major activity happening in the US, and just noting for people who might be still feeling quite agitated and upset about this, all of these activities and fast-moving changes are designed to be overwhelming and to make us feel out of control. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and out of control, that is by design. The issue's not you, it's them. Also, challenges that are happening in the UK that may have been kind of drowned out by what's happening in the US. Something that we've started touching on in both Claire's and Suzana's talks about AI and how it's affecting the pursuit of knowledge, and I put knowledge in inverted commas for a good reason, but how this is impacting commercial publishing, academic publishing, which is kind of relevant to us, and therefore what kind of outcomes might this be for libraries. So as has been alluded to, we know that there's a major disruption happening to research funding over in the US. And so I've got just lots of examples of different things. I've put in dates at the beginnings of the URLs because most of this material is literally only a few weeks old. And I want to put things in perspective about the kind of funding we're talking about. This, on the right-hand side, there's a screen grab of a story that's in a Financial Times article, and you don't need to know the detail, except the largest of the blue blurbs is the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the biggest funders in the world. And that's completely obliterated by the NIH amount. So I'll come back to that. I want you to remember that big red blob. So the kind of funding that's happening and funding cuts that are happening in the US are also affecting some of the funding that we're experiencing here in Australia, because the funding's being cut for certain types of research, and some of that research that's been funded by the US funding in Australia covers this sort of research that's no longer allowed, and so therefore we are also losing funding in Australia. But what you may not be as aware of is what's going on in the UK. They've got quite different funding challenges, and this is economic. It's not ideological or because of a change in government, although there has been one more or less recently. But there is a really big push on at the moment about a funding crisis for universities in the UK. So here's just a couple of articles about university funding issues and loss of jobs. And the picture on the right-hand side is kind of a collection of job losses that are happening across them. It's sort of a bit like Retraction Watch. They're just sort of following what's happening in terms of job losses. Are you feeling inspired yet? It gets better. Okay, so there's also research funding that's been slashed as well. So the QR cut is their kind of version of the block funding that goes to research. So there's a big cut to that, and the ministers have confirmed that the innovation budget will fail. So a lot less money being channeled into research itself. So that's money. And now let's talk about ideology, and look, acknowledging that the money side in the US is also ideological. So, but we now also have quite distinct restrictions on who people can research with and publish with, and what they can research or publish on. And so here we've got CDC staff told they can't work with World Health Organization. And we've also got the NIH regarding putting in restrictions on what can be published in relation to the executive order that relates to that. We've also had direct ideological interference with journals. We've got writing government people writing to medical journal editors to say, how are you showing we've got responsibilities to protect the public from misinformation. And so therefore, how are you dealing with competing viewpoints, which of course is actually what science is, but is not how it's being interpreted in these letters. And to put things into context, and this is this whole question of overwhelm, one of the things that came out relatively early and everyone was sort of reeling in horror at it was this question about certain words being excluded from articles and articles that had not yet been published, that had been submitted or even accepted for publication, had been authored by researchers in the US that had been funded by the government, were being vetted for certain words. And you'll see, I mean, the words themselves are, the list itself is shocking enough, but some of those words are kind of pretty fundamental to the nature of research itself. Sort of things like barrier and excluded or groups or status. These are sort of terms that you would just use in terms of describing one part of a research project compared to another. Like barrier, what about the blood-brain barrier, for example? And then, of course, there's what we can't possibly talk about, women, which is one of the words that's excluded. So this is pretty awful. Let's not pretend that it is not. But I just, on the left-hand side, you'll see a circle there around a particular point that is one of all of the different types of things that are happening in relation to this attack on research and research types and so on. So this list on the right-hand side is one of the strategies. So we've got this very, very big kind of program of work that's happening that's directly related to try to undermine what research is. So what does that mean for library budgets? What's going on in the library space as a result of all of this stuff? So in the US, one of the things that happened a couple of months ago was that there was a requirement for a change to the overheads put into research grants. Now, the overheads are normally what pays for things like the rent in the offices or labs that you're in, the electricity, your computer that you're using, and things like the library. The library budgets in institutions is primarily funded through the cream off, the material that caps in your indirect costs. Now, indirect costs can be sort of usually something between 35 and 50% and look, researchers hate it and they get very upset by this, but nonetheless, that's what it all pays for. So there was this requirement that we need to be much more efficient, and so therefore we'll only have 15% in our indirect costs available for these kinds of funding applications in the US. What that means is a huge cost or a huge reduction in ability for libraries to actually spend money on things like subscriptions and publications. So that's an indirect way to reduce the amount of money for US libraries. But there's also a direct way, which was the reducing the scope of the bureaucracy, and in particular the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Now, the Museum of Library Services is a mechanism for distributing funding, amongst other things, to libraries. It does all sorts of things, but one of the things it does is distribute federal funding to libraries. So this is a direct mechanism to mean that libraries are going to be receiving more funding in the US. Less funding in the US. Sorry, I'm getting all confusing. So that's all pretty awful, right? Everything I've just said is awful. Let's not just pretend it's not, it is. But what does that actually mean when we start thinking about the publisher side of this? So we've been talking a lot about the library side of things and our community and our audience and our users, but from a publisher point of view, this is pretty serious. So what's been happening in the UK is we've had so far 3 universities that have just not renewed their Elsevier big deals. So that's what the biggest of the big deals. They've just said, we can't afford it. We are going to not renew. And that means that we are no longer going to subscribe to this material for the reading purposes. And if anybody wants to publish open access, they're going to have to pay an article processing charge. We're not going to cover it through some sort of agreement. So we're seeing this really beginnings of the erosion of what has been built up as this big sort of solution to our needs for open access. It's starting to crumble. We've also got other cuts in the UK, not just the big deal. So this is the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, and their funding cuts means that they are affecting their purchasing ability beyond things like the big deal. So there's a lot less purchasing that would traditionally be expected to be just part of the corpus that gets purchased. So there's going to be a big effect, a knock-on effect on commercial academic publishing. And so there, in March 17, there was a talk about the academic publishing bracing for shutdown, for slowdown as these purges come in. And also we've got journal cancellations also in the US, not necessarily for funding reasons, but for ideological reasons. So we've got fewer subscriptions in to these materials. But also, if we've got all these funding cuts, we have got less research being undertaken and less research being published as well. And that's we're going to see that pretty quickly. We'll see that next 2 years, there's going to be a massive drop in the amount of material actually being published, simply because there were fewer people doing the research. We've got science journals not accepting submissions because they are citing National Institutes of Health costs or cuts. Similarly, the Lancet's talking about, which is in the UK, that medical journals shouldn't be expected to be spared. So this is not just American, it's the UK talking about this as well. So that's what's sort of going on in terms of how much research funding is being affected, therefore how much research is being produced. And we've also got library budgets being cut because of various reasons, and therefore inability to be able to continue to subscribe. So this is really pretty unstabilizing from the academic publishing point of view. But on top of that, we've got a train crash happening here. We've got the burning disaster that's the US, and we've got the burning kind of like weird thing that's AI that's coming in, and they are smashing together at the same time. So let's talk about this AI elephant. So this has been touched upon by both Claire and Suzana, but the question about not just hallucinations of material, of pretend citations. In some ways, that was the forebear for what we're now starting to see, which is this new wonderful AI solution, which is summarizing. So we've got reviews of literature going on by various AI products, and these are problematic in multiple ways, and not least if something gets in there that is later retracted, it's very hard to get back out again. And so we've seen examples where there's a particular cancer research paper that was retracted because it had some pretty major flaws in it. And that is now being put forward as advice coming out of summaries from AI because it's in there and you can't actually get it back out again. And so here we have some examples of articles talking about issues in relation to this summarizing question, and the answers are if the question is, can AI review the scientific literature? Well, the answer is no, not really. And here's one example on the right-hand side where a summary trashed an author's work and took a really enormous amount of effort to be corrected. So we're just seeing this completely new way of us trying to deal with a problem with information. It used to be, when we were talking about predatory publishers, it's really challenging to get a researcher off the editorial board of who'd just been placed on arbitrarily onto an editorial board of a predatory publisher. This is kind of the new frontier of the same sort of problem. Here's another example of poor AI summarizing. The issue about exaggerating findings, and then there was on the right-hand side, there's a correspondence and discussion in Blue Sky about how paper mill production is just going through the roof with AI. AI is not causing this, it is simply exacerbating an existing problem. It's made something that was already problematic just be able to start operating at scale because it's much easier. And then there's a question which will probably put fear into the hearts of some of the people on this call today, but the query there is, and this is just Richard Severs just talking about a conference he's at, and this Shawan is talking about one of the impacts of AI could be that systematic reviews may become meaningless, which is obviously worrying for us. However, when we look at who's using AI in the library space, we love it. We are one of the biggest users of it, and partly I think it's because we are trying to work out what it means. So we are sitting up there as you know, high users of AI. Well done, everybody. Look at us win at life. But we need to be just calming down, I think, on the potential impacts, because there is this real question about, oh, is it going to take out all these jobs? And so all these people are going to become redundant and it's going to take over and blah, 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 blah. So far, we haven't necessarily seen evidence of that. So this is a report that came out about a week and a half ago. I haven't put a date on that one. And it's talking about whether or not generative AI is replacing jobs or hurting wages. And the answer is not so far. And then the question on the right, the article on the right, is one that's talking about some work that's happening in all of these companies where the projects are failing. And AI, as we know, is incredibly energy absorbing. It uses huge amounts of energy. And these data centers are becoming distressed assets. We've got an issue about return on investment. Now, so for those of you will remember, most of you will remember that we had the enormous shutdown, was it last year, of all systems, and banks went down and airports went down and all that sort of stuff. That was this particular company, and that company that was responsible for this global IT outage. They're saying they're going to cut jobs and use AI, right? And so that's the sort of headline that you can go, oh no, people are losing their jobs because of AI. And this is not necessarily the case. The argument here is saying that these pressures, and this is one of them, is they're facing big pressure to deliver on the big investments made in AI. But these productivity gains just aren't coming through. And so I saw something on a discussion the other day, which I thought was quite interesting, which was saying maybe AI is a bit like microwaves. You know, when microwaves came out, for those of you who remember, I remember my auntie saying, don't look in the microwave when it's on because it's going to burn out your eyeballs, right? But apart from the radioactivity problem of it, there was all this discussion about how it was going to revolutionize cooking. And we had all these like microwave cookbooks that came out, and it was all going to be the way of the future. And the reality is we defrost meat in it and we heat up our tea. It didn't revolutionize cooking. Right. So it could be that that's where we're going. So let's all just calm down a bit, is what I'm trying to say on the whole AI taking over the world question. So where are we at in my last 4 minutes? What does this mean to us in academic libraries in Australasia? One of the things is open access. When we talk about the law, the loss of data, and all of the issues that are going on, open access really is the way for us to start overcoming all of this. We need to be making sure that our data, the information that we're producing and publishing in journals overseas that may or may not fall over, that there are copies of this work locally, and we try and make it openly available. So open access is very much offering us a way forward. And we're already doing this stuff. We just need to bring it up to scale. It also gives us a really good way of pushing against prevailing winds that are leaning towards book bans and removing content. When things are open access and in multiple places, it's really hard to do that. So this is where we should be really putting our attention. And look, as you all know, I've been an open access advocate forever. So obviously I'm going to say this, but I really do think this is true. The other thing is, rather weirdly, in the environment that's happening in the US, is that the Nelson memo, which is the implementation date for the National Institutes of Health's public access policy, they've brought it forward by 6 months. So they're speeding up that process, presumably people in the NIH saying, well, let's just make this happen, because if we don't, it won't. So there's some really good news happening out there in the open access space. And to be honest, I'm not sure it would be a bad thing if we started in Australia moving back in towards European Horizon kind of funding rather than the US, from an open access point of view, an open scholarship point of view, because the Europe work is so much more heavily weighted towards the open space. So if we did start moving towards Europe in terms of our funding requirements and reliance, then I think that probably would be a positive thing. And then we come to this question about knowledge, and knowledge in inverted commas. And this is what we've kind of alluded to all the way through all 3 of the talks, which is, what is knowledge if we outsource the entire research process? So we've got this Elsevier sort of product, of which one of, as I'm sure you're all aware of, many, many, many of them, where, don't worry, we'll give you the literature review. We'll run a summary over it and write what looks like an actual literature review. And even if it is not hallucinating the references, even if it really is providing actual references to real things, the likelihood and the number of times that person will click through and actually read the original material, and this is the Suzana sort of secondary reference, tertiary reference question there, is probably extremely low. And then on the right-hand side, we have an argument from Mark Hannell from Digital Science, and he's saying, well, we can speed up the sort of like research process because we can sort of consolidate a whole lot of research data and start processing it really quickly, and we don't need to worry about it because we can make it go faster. but who's reading it? It's like a drone war. It's like, okay, I'm going to have a war with my friend, but I don't want to fight them, so I'm just going to send my drone up. They can send their drone up, and if the drones can fight each other, we'll go to the beach and have a nice swim. It's becoming almost a drone war with this whole process of I read a really interesting quote. It was increasingly academics are being approached by bots who are sending them pre-written emails requesting them to do peer review for articles that were primarily written by AI that will never be read by anybody. And this is the problem with academia. And so I think that aspect of AI is something we do need to think about. But we do need to, in the academic environment, really think, what does this mean for us in an academic library in terms of discovery and search? That's where we really need to be thinking about putting our energy. It's helping our community sift through the crap and get to where they need to get to. But also, we've moved so far beyond teaching people about Boolean searches, it's not funny. We really need to be thinking about where are we going to. Our usage stats are down because material is either being summarised or it's open access and they don't need to come through the catalogue. So what are we doing about that? That's the conversation we really need to be having fast. But, challenge, opportunity, two halves of the same coin. So this gives us this is a massive disruption. What's happening is hugely disruptive, and that's massively opportunistic for us because we've been looking for a disruption for a long time. The scholarly communication system and the process and the move to big deals and the move to transformative agreements and the consolidation into a small number of companies and everything just getting worse and worse and worse needed something to blow it up. Well, here we are. Here's our opportunity to really make something happen. And libraries have always done that. So this is the time that libraries have got to lead with intention. We can't wait for certainty. It's not going to happen. It's not a strategy. We need to be on the front foot and start really thinking about where do we want to go? How do we want to make this work? What's our goal? So where are we? We need to really think about discovery. It's very important about understanding what discovery means in an open world and an AI world. We really need to think about why we're paying for read. Are people reading? We've got a highly volatile environment for publishers, so we really should not be locking ourselves into multi-year deals. They themselves are saying, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 years, so why would we sign a 3-year deal with them? We really need to focus on strengthening open access. We need to look at open educational resources, diamond open access, rights retention. That's where we should be doing a whole heap of work. And we also need to think about redirecting our acquisition funds, maybe the funds we're spending on previously on our reading funds, into open infrastructure, to supporting those open infrastructure options. So that's my call to action, and that's the end of my slides.
Thank you so much, Danny, for leaving us with that sense of hope. It's been fantastic, and the many fascinating things to add to our professional reading piles and discussions. There's also been quite a bit of discussion in chat and some wonderful links flying around. So it's been very entertaining to follow. So hopefully you get to catch up on that soon. So next, Fiona will get to the audience questions, and we have received, and we'll talk through as many of them as possible with the speakers. So thanks, Fiona, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Danny, Suzana, and Claire. That's given us all a lot to think about. And yeah, as Lisa said, the chat has been spiraling. I think there's about I don't know how many different threads of conversation to follow. So yeah, I'd encourage people to take a look at that afterwards through the recording. We have quite a lot of questions, so we probably won't get through all of them, but what I'm going to start with is, and this is a question for any of you, but I might start with Claire. How do we avoid being complacent about what's happening elsewhere with disappearing information and political interference? And are we making assumptions about Australia being safer than other countries?
That's an easy question to answer. Thanks, Fiona. Thank you to the thoughtful person who wrote that question to start us off. I guess in my reflections, I mean, part of it is about knowing our context. So I know there's been a lot of chatter in the chat about what's happening, particularly with the firing of the Librarian of Congress and that sort of thing in the US. So obviously the US has a very different political situation with appointments and leaders of national bodies like that being determined through executive appointment. That is very different here. I think, you know, without sort of getting into politics, I think, you know, there are a lot of differences between our countries. I think from and this is personally anecdotal, it is not necessarily based on any evidence whatsoever. But I think the biggest danger in our country, from what I've seen and from my little passion project last year, is apathy and neglect. Things that happen quietly rather than things that happen with a big noise, like we're seeing over the waters. So I do think it comes back to being very clear about why we do what we do and making sure that what we do in wherever you work is really underpinned by our industry ethics and values. So the Australian Library and Information Association actually published ethics, a code of ethics, I think about 18 months ago for the very first time. And that is specific to the Australian context. If you haven't read those, I'd encourage you to go on and look at them. It is something I had thought about putting in my presentation and then got sidetracked. But I think if we know who we are and if we are committed personally to acting ethically and keeping a watchful brief, particularly for things that happen quietly, then we can make a difference. Sorry, it's a very difficult question to answer in a short period of time with no preparation.
And multifaceted. Yeah, and I've sort of been reflecting a little bit on what you were saying earlier around making assumptions that other people know what we know as well. You know, we get exposed to things all the time, and sometimes it's easy to forget that other people aren't in the same bubbles as us, and I've had conversations with other people about that kind of bubble as well. Danny, did you want to add anything from the political inference side of things?
So I chose not to, because I started with 103 slides and got down to 36.
Well done, Danny.
So I left out whole chunks when part of it was that whole data being lost. So I have just put into the answer, I don't know how it works in Q&A. You might have to look at the answered one. I've just put in a bunch of links to some of the activities that are going on to save data. So there's because, you know, it's the library community coming to the rescue, isn't it? So, and they've been amazing. So there's a whole heap of series. That's just a few of organisations and groups that are just going, all right, we're getting everything we can, or I'm looking after this bit, send it to me, or it's incredible. There's a huge amount of work going on to try and rescue things. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And I guess the question, are we being naive to think it's not going to come our way? I suspect that our concern might be that some of our research and work that's happened in Australia is mixed up in that. That's where we need to be thinking about ensuring our data is looked after.
Yeah.
May I add something here?
Yeah, of course.
Just at the time when there was German election, and there was about the time when the US election was happening as well, I talked with a young person who works for a non-for-profit organization in European Union, and it is around environmental issues. And he was saying that the moment they've heard about US elections, they started looking at the language they're using in their documents, cleaning it up to make it more palatable. What I'm saying here, and mind you, I'm coming from the Balkans, so I've sort of seen quite a few rounds of various historical things happening. I think it is incredibly important to be aware how it starts creeping in everyday life, in everyday discourse, and believing that giving a finger is going to stop someone from taking the whole hand is just not going to happen. It's not how it works. So what I'm saying is that issue is not only what's on the big scene, there are lots of little things to watch and to be aware of, and really be conscious of defending of what we think is an important territory.
Thanks, Suzana. In terms of librarian resistance, I did see that Rachel Norman posted in the chat about what's happening with the alternative. There's a group called Alternative National Parks, and that they've commented on the resistance being led by librarians in the States. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Suzana, would you like to take this one? What role should our sector advocacy and representative bodies such as ALIA, CALL, etc., take beyond advocacy, so taking an active role and active projects led, directed and supported by these bodies?
One issue I've been hearing from people I talk with, and also thinking where LARC sits and all of these things. Is ALIA a member association or it is professional association? Who are they representing? Who, or saying they, it's all of us. But I think it is, talking about silos, I think it is very difficult to tease these issues out and to say this is my area and this is your area, but really understanding that as a profession we have a common ground to represent and defend. I'm using defend quite consciously because this is the environment in some ways. I would like to think that ALIA and other associations are representing the profession. I would like to see that happening. I'm not always convinced that that's the case. And we need to ask ourselves, what do we want as a profession?
Danny or Claire, do you have anything to add with regard to sector representative body advocacy for libraries?
No, I think the person who wrote this question, I think Em, has actually put a comment in the chat as her response to her own action, which is around that sort of small actions and their collective actions don't necessarily need to be directed by an official body. So there are things we can do as individuals. There are things we can do within our institutions. There are things that we can do collaboratively across institutions, and there are things we can do in partnership, not only with associations within our sector, but looking at partnerships across different parts of the community. So I think, you know, one of the points that I had on one of my slides was around to work in a collective endeavour. And I think that is a great strength of our industry, is that unlike, say, industries that are, you know, more based in a capitalist mindset, I think in the library and information industries, we do have that commitment to sharing knowledge with each other and sharing our collective experience. And I think, you know, that is a strength, and that's something that we can draw on as we move through this next evolution.
Yeah, I think sometimes we shouldn't underestimate the power of individuals doing small things in our own sphere of influence. So obviously working as a collective has much more impact, but you know, Danny was talking about hope.
And also, we haven't talked about this at all today, but the ProQuest announcement about not being able to have perpetual access to books, which we all went, you must be joking. And CALL was one of the organisations that wrote a very strongly worded objection to this, amongst others. And ProQuest has backed off, and it's extended the period of time. So things are happening.
You all. The next question, and I see Danny's popped some activity in response to this question, but is there anything, or is there something we can do to collectively address the fact that some universities in Australia block sites like the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine, especially as we're now seeing how essential these tools are for keeping governments accountable and providing access to publicly funded research that has been removed?
I don't think that's a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it depends on the purpose of why. I mean, there are lots of good reasons why these sites are blocked. For example, the Internet Archive, yeah, there are great cybersecurity reasons to block that, and that's really up to the institution. But if there is a reason that information source needs to be used in the context of teaching, learning or research at your institution, then that's specific to your institution, and you need to have that conversation with the powers that be. I think where we get into trouble is where we have these kind of blanket approaches to things. I don't think that's critical thinking, and I don't think that's about remembering the human. So yeah, I don't think one size fits all is necessarily an appropriate answer for that one.
Yeah, it's a case by case. Yeah. Okay. Claire, I do have another question for you. This is the question here is that you've made some good points about convenience. So access, satisfying, easy access to information. So what can we do as libraries to make what we do convenient, and can we compete? And I think that's competing with AI in particular, I'm assuming here, but more broadly with easy access.
So I know there was another question there, is what that someone else asked about what lessons have we learned from history, and I'm just going to try and answer both of them here. So the word I'm going to pick up here is compete, and answer that with, well, why should we compete? So I was having a conversation with someone last week, and I said, look, my approach to this, I'm going to use the metaphor of the media industry. So if we think about the media environment that we have access to now, if we go back to the 1930s, there were two sources of media in this particular country. There was newspapers and there was radio. Then television was added. Oh, sorry, there was cinema as well, of course. So we had, three, and then television was added, and television didn't kill movies. And now we have a whole range of different media sources on which to draw. We have the internet for all sorts of different alternative news platforms. We have streaming services. We have podcasts, and radio has not died because podcasts have come in. And I look at my experience in libraries over the last couple of decades, and I actually see how the work that I've done has been enhanced with the addition of these tools and resources and sources of information. So the work and the environment that I'm working in now is very different to when I started in 2001. It's not worse off. And, I remember conversations with, libraries were thinking we had to compete with Google, or compete with Wikipedia, or, whatever it was. And they've all just become part of what we, part of the information ecosystem in which we operate. So I don't think we're going to compete with AI. I think AI is here. It is part of what we do. What we need to do is understand where we add value and how we help guide and navigate people through a richer information ecosystem. So, yeah, I don't think it's about competing. I do think, the things that we have that are probably inconvenient are probably provided by our vendors. So we can work with them perhaps to make things easier to use. But I'll be really honest, when I was researching this, I did not go to my library website first. I did some internet searching, and then I found things behind paywalls, and I went back to my library and I logged in and I did all the things. So I think, let's be honest. We all use all of these things. As Danny's pointed out, librarians are right up there getting stuck into AI because we're learning how to use it. So it's not about competing. We're not competing here, but we need to be using those extra skills that we have as information professionals in order to help people understand, to think critically, to have those job-ready skills for the future where they will be using AI applications, and to ensure that we are remaining trusted because we are authentic, empathetic, and logical.
It's a good point about working with our vendors as well. Okay, next question. Suzana, how do we do more to build solidarity across silos in our institutions and communities, especially in times of budget cuts and restructures? We can't challenge mis or disinformation, discrimination and hate, and improve reading, research and critical thinking on our own. We do have an important role to play in collaboration, not competition, with others like academic skills advisors and teachers. So I know you have the school library perspective. What do you have in response to that question and those comments?
Actually, I'm not in the library anymore, but nevertheless, it doesn't really matter, and it shouldn't matter because these various disciplines don't sit in separate containers, and distinct containers. Right now, one good example I can see is that universities are going through tremendous cuts. Schools, for example, and I know that other places in industry as well have been for a long time, well, very desirable ground for researchers, for libraries, maybe not that much, but researchers do want to have more connection with the industry because that helps them get the data, lift off the projects, get some funding. On the other side, I see how industry is craving for good resources. Having access to databases is gold. And, you know, there are some things that can be possibly combined, not necessarily through libraries. And that's again about silos. If you think about university library as something that's separate entity from the university, that's a bit of a problem. If you think about, I'm now leading a research function at school, and it is really connected with everything else because research is part of everything else. So the questions would be where we can remove barriers, how can we help each other, how can we maybe negotiate different terms of agreement, even job descriptions. If we have set in stone job descriptions in which you can't add another part, extension to what you're doing, as is my, let's say, industry fellow at UTS, which my organization obviously supports. But if you can't do that easily, how can you easily collaborate and branch out and collaborate in new ways? If we say this is the licensing agreement for databases, there is no way we can give you access, well, you're not giving me what I need. So, I mean, it's really, I worked with a very clever researcher, fantastic historian, Professor Peter Reed, and he had a wonderful ability to talk with people, collaborate with people, and ask, what do you want to get out of it? Straightforward. And people would say what they want to get out of it. So I think as a profession, we need to have more conversations like that. And really say clearly, this is what we are bringing to the table.
We're not the only ones that care about this. It's working with the other people that also care about this, and many groups across both schools and universities. So building lots of partnerships in the right places. Yeah. Danny, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was a great answer, Suzana.
Excellent. The next comment here is actually it's more of a comment rather than a question, but just reflecting on acknowledging the firing of Dr. Carla Hayden and the Librarian of Congress, and noting that she was an exemplary library leader advocating for libraries and our role countering misinformation and mistrust. I think that this has been such a big thing to happen in the States in the last few days, and I'm not sure if it's a permanent replacement or acting replacement, happens to be Trump's defense lawyer from one of his earlier cases. So I think there's also obviously a misunderstanding of the purpose of the Library of Congress for the reason given for Carla Hayden's sacking being around inappropriate books for children, when you can't access a library until you're 16 anyway. So yeah, I think it's certainly a sobering thing to have happened. I don't know, Danny, Claire, Suzana, did you want to comment at all?
Yeah, look, I think it's because she was such a champion of these things is why she's not there anymore. But it does, the whole Library of Congress thing was another chunk of information that we didn't talk about today, but there are definitely pretty fundamental implications if the Library of Congress subject heading, you know, it starts getting corrupted, which it's sort of already begun. You know, what do we do? Or if it falls over completely, you know, that's a pretty, you know, really nerdy library problem that most people wouldn't even know about. So
I see it as a great example of how something that's not my problem becomes actually my problem. And when it starts with weeding school libraries, and it was happening on periphery, and then it suddenly became one of the reasons for sacking the Library of Congress librarian, which obviously is completely mixing issues, and it's completely different what Library of Congress does and what school library does. But thinking in the society is there. And this is again about giving a finger and actually giving the whole hand. It is really important not to see these issues as it's not my problem, it concerns someone else. It is everyone's problem. And raising that awareness is quite important.
Yeah. We are just about out of time. There are so many more questions, and I know that sort of ended on a little bit of a flat note. So just in 30 seconds, Danny, would you like to give us a message of hope? Because I know that you've been thinking a lot about the positives, and Suzanne,
I am
you've talked
hopeful.
about,
I think this is a really exciting time. I know it's always, change is always scary, and there's certainly a whole heap of things that are really terrible. There's no question about that. But I really think that this is a really, it's the most hopeful I've felt since I've started in the open access space, that we really can actually affect some really dynamic change, big shifting change. And that's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, because change always is. But I think the outcome that we're going to end up with is probably going to be a better one. And as Claire and Suzana talked about, the progression through time, this isn't the first time we've dealt with this. Open access had exactly the same response as well. Like it's cyclical. We're just in a cycle. So let's not stress. A lot of us have been through this cycle before. We'll get there. And actually, Claire and Suzana are both right in terms of this is a collective action. We do this together. We look after each other. That's the way that we will get through this and really make it a positive and really good outcome for everybody.
And Suzana, as you said earlier, never waste a good crisis. Thank you so much. I think it's been such a rich presentation from each of you, and there's been some wonderful engagement in the chat and through the discussion, the questions and answers. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm now going to pass over to Beth to bring this webinar home.
Thanks, Fiona, for facilitating the Q&A. I'd also like to thank Claire, Suzana and Danny for sharing their insights and expertise with us. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, especially Sarah, for helping to organise and run this event. You can contact any of the speakers with further questions you may have after the webinar. Just send an email to members@caval.edu.au and the team will forward your questions. As an earth-loving thank you gift to our presenters, Caval has organised for native trees to be planted through the organisation, 15 trees. These trees will be planted by Landcare Group during this autumn-winter tree planting session. We've got lots of activities coming up in the pipeline for the remainder of 2025, and we look forward to seeing you all at them too. Thank you everyone for attending today and contributing through the Q&A. Enjoy the rest of the day.